I mean, everything, literally, everything that I thought I knew about the border there, especially Tijuana, was completely wrong.
Hello, I am Enrique Quesada, and this is Mexico Center, a podcast from the Center for the United States and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. The region around the U.S.-Mexico border is often depicted in a negative light. Life in the border city is complex. The wall or fence that separates the United States from Mexico is not just a reality that residents learn to live with, but an element with which many interact on a daily basis as they travel to school, to work, or simply shop. But border communities from each side also learn to cooperate with each other, and according to author and journalist Michael Malone, there is no better example than Tijuana and San Diego. As Malone writes in his new book, El Tercer País, San Diego and Tijuana, two countries, two cities, one community. With distinctly different births, the two cities spent the first 2 centuries developing intense contrast to each other. But in the last 50 years, they have begun to accept their common destiny and work together in a manner that is not only unique, but remarkable given their past. These twin cities offer a model for border cooperation for the rest of the world. To talk more about the book and the growing relationship between Tijuana and San Diego, I called Michael Malone. Michael S. Malone is one of the world's best-known high-technology business journalists. He is the author or co-author of nearly 30 books, including such award-winning works as The HP Way, The Intel Trinity, and The Virtual Corporation. Malone is Dean's Executive Professor at Santa Clara University. Here's our conversation. Michael Malone, author of El Tercer País and Dean's Executive Professor at Santa Clara University, thank you for being on the Mexico Center podcast.
Oh, thank you for having me on.
So in this book, which came out last October, you talk about San Diego and Tijuana. In fact, you say it's 2 cities, 2 countries, but 1 community. And there's this shared border region called El Tercer País, or the third country. I hadn't actually heard about this term before. I read the book. But if I understood correctly, it refers to the area just on each side of the border where there's a lot of traffic. It's 70,000 vehicles cross the border every morning, 20,000 pedestrians, just one of the 2 ports of entry that exist between the 2 cities. So can you, and you start with this picture of what this looks like. Can you kind of tell us about that?
Yeah, sure. The name came because I began to realize that I was writing about Tijuana and I was writing about San Diego and their interaction, but there was another place. And that was right around the border, literally blocks on either side. You know, on the San Diego side, it probably goes in a half a mile because there's a lot of room there. And then on the Tijuana side, it just goes to the plaza there. It's just a few blocks where the maquiladoras are and then also the shops. And I was struck that this area had a very different culture than either city. That it was becoming kind of a hybrid, a new culture, a new society with its own mores and language and everything else. And I brought it up to a gentleman who's been involved on both sides of the border for many, many years, involved with the Border Coalition. And I said, this is like another place. And he said, yeah, I've heard it called El Tercer País. And I go, what is that? He said, the third country. And I said, there's the book title. And it turns out it's been used occasionally in the past. But the reason you haven't heard of it is because it's been pretty rare up until now. But it struck me that it really captured the new relationship between those 2 cities. It's something very different is being forged. And it challenges the notion of national sovereignty. It redefines the nature of the border. And I think it's going to be a blueprint for cross-border pairs of cities, twin cities around the world.
If I'm not mistaken, you live in Northern California, right?
Yeah, I'm a NorCal guy.
Yeah, so I'm curious about how this book came to be. Because I am myself from the border region. I grew up in Mexicali. I was born there and raised there.
So a lot of and I have family in Tijuana, so I've crossed through San Isidro and Otay. Like I know those places, perhaps not Tijuana that well, but I know the border region and what it's like to exist in those cities where it's the fence, the wall is just another reality that you learn to live with.
Right. I was astonished. I expected to go down there and see the wall cutting through this dead man's zone.
Right.
And everything else. And then I go to the Las Americas Retail Outlet Center with all those 80 stores or something. And it's like J. Crew and some of those other ones literally bump up against the wall on the U.S. side. And then you cross into Tijuana, and there's houses and stuff almost up to the wall. I mean, it's been assimilated already into the daily life of those communities. It's like it's not even there. I found myself looking up and going, "Oh, there's the wall." I was down at going through some of the factories in the maquiladoras, and it was like it's going through the back of the parking lot. Yeah. Nobody seems to care anymore. You wanted the genesis of the book. There's a gentleman in San Diego. I think he's 93 now, and he is Mr. San Diego. Anywhere you go in San Diego has his imprint. You go down to the yacht club. You look at the USS Midway carrier. You go up to above, you see San Diego, all the stem cell research facilities. They all have his name on them somewhere. And his name is Malone Burnham. And he's easily the most influential man that's ever existed in San Diego. Well, Malone wanted to write a book about community service, philanthropy. And he contacted Silicon Valley Press up here in the Valley, and I helped those guys out. And I helped him write the book. And he had such a great time doing it that all of a sudden he came back a couple of years later and said, I want to write, we're doing phenomenal stuff down here, connecting these two cities. I want to tell the story of that. It's taken 30 years to get here, and I want some sort of permanent record. And I said, well, that's a really interesting topic, but, I'm a Northern California guy. That's not my reality. He said, yeah, you'll do fine. And, I used 40 years as a journalist as my instruments to do this. And I had a great assistant named Cheryl Duminsnell. She's actually a widely published poet and a former professor. And she did several dozen interviews that I was able to pick through because I realized that I couldn't tell the story of what has gone on in the last 30 years unless I told the full story of the last 200 years. Because there are so many stereotypes in the United States about Tijuana. I needed to understand the dynamic between the two cities, but also the dynamic of these two cities with their capital cities. Right. And what I discovered was both of them are on the corners of their countries. Washington, D.C. only cares about San Diego when there's a problem or, the Navy needs to park another ship there. Mexico City resents Tijuana because it's becoming so successful. And, I got this vibe that in many ways these two cities were driven together because they have a common destiny, but they also have a common place in the world, especially with their own countries. But I really want to tell that integrated story because I think it's really important. And then the second, the last 50,000, 60,000 words of the book, I really keyed in on how did it happen that San Diego, the big brother, and Tijuana, the little brother, San Diego, this shining city, on the beach and all that, and Tijuana, this rough border town. How do they come to this kind of mutual understanding and agreement and respect over the last 30 years? And I found it came from all sorts of sources. This all began as a grassroots effort, but in time, both cities began to realize that, wait a minute, we have more in common with each other. Now, remember, when they started out, San Diego was a city in the 1890s. It had the Del Coronado Hotel, and it had tall buildings, and it had all this stuff. And it had the mission, which was crucial, because wherever the mission was, that was what was going to grow first. It had all that. Tijuana was still a ranch with a few houses. So it's not surprising that San Diego looked upon Tijuana as just a poor little border community. But now they can't escape the fact it is a giant city. More than that, it's a young city. While San Diego, the population is, increasingly retired military people and a few tech companies. Tijuana is about 20 years younger average age. And so that's where the dynamic has moved to, too. That gives us, and then finally, through guys like Alan Burson, who was the border czar, you have visionaries saying, we got to improve this border. I crossed the border the first time, I think, late 50s, early 60s. It was a mess because there were so few lanes and there were so many hangups. It was hours to get across the border. Well, the final step was the two countries saying, let's improve let's improve the throughput of the border. And that had to do with a lot of research that took place in the 70s and 80s and 90s about who's crossing the border. I mean, there was this myth that it was, we have undocumented people sneaking across, and then we have like produce farmers or something crossing back, and drug dealers passing back and forth. And they discovered, no, these are just regular folks going to work on either side, business people and all that. And so both sides finally decided, let's make this work. Let's make this border work. And that's why we have this incredible setup now. That was the final step to making it all really explode.
Yeah. So you mentioned like there's this like kind of key points, like prohibition is one that helped Tijuana grow, but he also gave it a reputation that you say kind of can continue in some ways to this day. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, there's several key events. Well, first of all, let's go back all the way to the beginning. The Mexican War. I mean, Ulysses Grant, who was a hero of the Mexican War, admitted later that it was completely illegal. It was a setup. President Polk wanted to square off the United States in the Southwest, and he used a pretext and started a war. I mean, the United States was triumphant. Mexico was defeated. They had lost all of this land, this enormous territory in the north. So that began a tension that, it went on for more than a century. Then we have the Mexican Revolution. And I think most people don't realize there was a battle in Tijuana. There is the Battle of Tijuana. And it had an interesting secondary effect. One thing was the Americans looked down and said, oh, my God, it's like violent civil war down there. The town is burning. There's cannon fire going on. We got to build this border up to protect ourselves. But the other thing that happened was all the women and children in Tijuana streamed north out of the city when the battle began. And they went on the hillside there, just across the American border, to see, on the American side, to watch. Well, they were joined by all these San Diegans who wanted to see the battle too. And they all started talking to each other. And it was the first time there was this sort of connection being made. Literally at the same time, we have prohibition. Well, the United States bans alcoholic beverages. Mexico doesn't. It's still legal. Before, you just had a few ladies, society ladies, going down to Tijuana to go to curio shops. Now, you got a lot of American men, wealthy American men and others, streaming across the border to go to the bars in Tijuana. And that began the dark years. Tijuana hugely prospered by it. Booze, prostitution, illegal everything, according to U.S. standards. So people started coming down. Movie stars started coming down from Hollywood and going to the spa, the hot springs, and spending a lot of money and going to the bullfights and the racetracks and gambling, which you couldn't do either, having a great time. Well, all of a sudden, you notice in the 20s and 30s in movies, all of a sudden Mexico makes a lot of appearances in U.S. movies because it became the cool place to go. It was the Vegas of the 20s and 30s. The positive impact, a lot of money streamed into Tijuana, build up a lot of infrastructure. Downside, a lot of crime, organized crime, and you get a terrible reputation during those years. 40s come along, whole new game. Now you have, 500,000 U.S. sailors and soldiers and Marines heading towards San Francisco and San Diego. Well, they're going to go into the Pacific, and they're thinking to themselves, I'm 19 years old, and I'm probably going to die. Let's have some fun before we go. So there's the image we have of the drunken sailors in Tijuana, getting in fights and drinking and carousing and all of that. Tijuana actually banned Marines because they were making too much trouble. Meanwhile, San Diego took advantage of this. San Diego had its own crime problem, but it got to present itself. It's the noble, clean city. And they got to shove all of their problems across the border in Tijuana. And then finally we get to the 50s. And now in the 50s, we're starting to begin to see retreats and vacation places and all that springing up in Mexico. You have a lot of ex-sailors and GIs with their families and their station wagons. That was the first time I went, was going with my family down through San Diego and going into Tijuana, going down to Ensenada. And then really in the 60s and 70s, the San Diego Union Tribune sets up a bureau in Tijuana, starts covering Tijuana news and business. You have the businessmen starting to make connections. Tijuana is settling down into a maturing city. Then obviously we have these turning points. One of them was the end of the Vaqueros program and the beginning of undocumented workers coming north, especially during hard times in Mexico. And that's creating a growing concern in the United States that is taking away jobs and all that. So, literally everything that I thought I knew about the border there, especially Tijuana, was completely wrong. I had no idea how sophisticated Tijuana's medical operations are. It is now the #1 medical tourism destination in the world. The skyscrapers, there'll be two of them. One's a hospital and one is the hotel holding the people going to the hospital and coming out of the hospital. That every morning, hundreds of doctors get up in Chula Vista and drive across the border to their medical offices in Tijuana. And they're down there 3 days a week, and they're up in San Diego 2 days a week. Everything was inverted. I did a whole section in there about Taylor guitar. I think you read it. Mexico, craft work. This is where you go to get the really good crafts, the silver. I remember you used to get your car detail, the upholstery done in Tijuana, all of the hand stuff, while all of the, automated stuff, San Diego. Well, I look at Taylor guitar. Where do they make the handcrafted stuff? San Diego. Where do they make the robot-built, AI-designed, highly affordable guitars, where they're really driving the cutting edge of the technology just south of the border? Everything's backwards from what I thought. And then I go into Las Americas retail outlet. I think I was the only American in the Las Americas retail outlet. Why? Because it's cheaper to buy retail stuff in United States than it is to buy it in Mexico, especially right there at the border. It's like, wait a minute, everything is wrong that I thought I knew. And that kind of compelled me. That was another reason. As I got into it, I really wanted to write this book because I wanted to explode all those myths and say, this is the new reality. It's really interesting. And I think it's going to be even more interesting in the years to come.
Yeah. So, I think, the book is really recent. So it even mentions the COVID-19 pandemic and what has happened. And I think even though the land border is closed for non-essential travel, there's still a lot of like trade being done because that can't stop.
Yeah, no, I thought it was really interesting. When I was writing the book, all of these older gentlemen, who had been doing this, who had been engaged in this for 40 years, said, we want this book because we're really afraid that all that we gain isn't permanent, that it can be lost. If something happens, we could go back to the status quo ante and this kind of looking at each other angrily across the border. We want to make these institutions permanent. When COVID hit, but I noticed even as the border was shut down physically, the attitude was not screw those people, we can't work with them. This is going to keep happening. But this real effort at amity, like we feel bad about this, we're doing this for medical reasons, don't take it personal, blah, 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 blah. Everybody on both sides seem to be working very hard not to let it impede what they've been doing. Increasingly, I think the two cities now identify with each other, that they have a common cause. They know they have a common destiny now. They're abutting each other.
Yeah. Well, I look forward to see also how the relationship continues to develop. And I think the book does a great job at looking at the history and just giving us a broader view of where this comes from, how it's evolved. But I enjoy the book, and I hope that people read it and see that there's this other reality of what life at the border is like. That's far away from the national rhetoric that we may hear on a daily basis.
Well, if it preserves the history and continues the conversation, I've done my job. It was kind of interesting during Innovadora. I moderated a Zoom panel. Gianna Napolitano, who had been Homeland Security, if you remember right, and Jose Antonio Meade, who had ran for president of Mexico. He was a foreign minister. Both great friends. And they really said that they were going to tell their people to read the book just so they know what's going on. We're making major decisions from ignorance. We don't understand the reality on the ground down there. And yet both governments are deciding the fate of that region. And they need to understand where it is now and where it has the potential of going. D.C. and Mexico City really need to get a closer look at what's going on there for the future of both countries and for the fate of those two cities. I mean, they've got a hell of an opportunity down there. And I just hope larger forces don't impede it. They can do something miraculous.
Well, Michael Malone, author of El Tercer País and Dean's Executive Professor at Santa Clara University, thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you.
That was Michael Malone. That is it for this episode. Thank you for listening to Mexico Centered. Thanks to Luis Huacata, our program manager, and to Tony Payan, the director of the Center for the United States and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. You can visit our website at bakerinstitute.org/Mexico, where you can find our latest publications. Views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the guest and the host, and do not necessarily reflect those of the center. If you have any comments or suggestions, you can email us at usmexicocenter@rice.edu. We would love to hear from you. Mexico Centered is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, Radio Public, and Spotify. You can subscribe through your favorite podcast app to receive all of our new episodes directly on your phone. I am Enrique Quesada. Happy holidays. Stay safe, wear a mask, and I will see you in the next year.